The sun was setting behind the neat rows of houses in the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a peaceful evening, with families finishing their dinners and children playing outside. For most residents, it was just another day in a community where everything had its place. But for one person, things were about to change in a big way. The protagonist, a middle-aged man named Alex, had lived in this neighborhood for years. He was a quiet man, always keeping to himself and doing his best to follow the rules. He loved his home, a small but cozy house with a well-maintained garden. Alex had always been a good neighbor, never causing trouble. He was the kind of person who would lend a hand to anyone in need, even if he didn't know them well. But there was one person in the neighborhood who had a problem with him: Karen. Karen was the president of the HOA, the Homeowners Association. She had been in charge for as long as anyone could remember, and she took her job very seriously. Some might say she took it a little too seriously. She had a habit of showing up at people's doors unannounced, pointing out small infractions of the neighborhood rules that no one else cared about. If you had a fence that was a few inches too tall or a lawn ornament that wasn't perfectly aligned, Karen was there to remind you. For months, Karen had been nitpicking Alex's property. First, it was the way he trimmed his hedges. Then it was the color of his front door, which she claimed was too bold. But Alex hadn't thought much of it. He figured she was just doing her job, even if it felt a little excessive. He didn't argue with her. After all, she was the HOA president, and people like her had a way of making life difficult for those who didn't comply. But things took a turn one afternoon. Karen appeared on Alex's doorstep with her usual stern expression. He had been in the middle of a quiet afternoon, enjoying his coffee on the porch, when he saw her marching toward his house. She didn't even knock. Instead, she opened the gate and walked right into his yard, clipboard in hand. "Alex," Karen said, her voice as sharp as ever. "I've come to inspect your lawn." Alex stood up, confused. "My lawn? Is there something wrong with it?" "Actually, yes," Karen replied, glancing down at her clipboard. "You've violated the HOA's new rule about decorative items. This gnome you've placed by the flower bed, it doesn't meet the new guidelines." Alex blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "The gnome," he repeated, his brow furrowing. "It's just a decoration. It's been there for years." "I know, but the HOA recently updated its guidelines. That gnome is too whimsical for the neighborhood." Karen gave him a pointed look, as if she expected him to immediately remove it. Alex shook his head. "I didn't get a notice about any new rules." "That's because it's a recent update," Karen said, her voice dripping with authority. "I'm giving you 1 week to remove it. If it's not gone by then, there will be a fine." Alex felt his frustration begin to grow. He had always been a patient man, but something about Karen's constant interference in his life was starting to wear him down. He had no intention of removing his gnome, not over something so trivial. But he knew better than to argue with Karen. She could be relentless when she wanted to be. "Fine," Alex said, trying to keep his tone calm. "I'll take it down, but I don't think it's necessary." Karen didn't seem to care about his opinion. She just nodded, checking off something on her clipboard. "Good. I'll be back to check in a week. Remember, the HOA takes these matters seriously." With that, Karen turned on her heel and left as quickly as she had arrived, leaving Alex standing there, feeling both confused and angry. He couldn't understand why she was making such a big deal out of something so insignificant. But he had learned long ago that arguing with Karen was like trying to fight a storm. It was better to just ride it out and hope it passed. The next few days were uneventful, but the tension in the neighborhood was starting to build. Alex noticed that Karen had been making more and more visits to other homes, and people were beginning to avoid her. They had grown tired of her constant surveillance and her habit of nitpicking every little detail. Still, most of them stayed silent, too afraid to stand up to her. It wasn't until a week later, when Alex was about to take the gnome down, that things took an unexpected turn. He received a notice in the mail, informing him that Karen had filed a complaint against him for not adhering to the HOA rules. The letter was formal, but it was clear that the HOA had sided with Karen, and there was no room for discussion. Alex's heart sank as he read the letter. It wasn't just about the gnome anymore. It felt like Karen was making an example out of him, trying to show everyone that she had control over their lives. He wasn't sure what had caused her to focus so much attention on him, but it was becoming clear that Karen wasn't someone who could be easily ignored. As he looked out his window at the neatly manicured lawn and the peaceful street, Alex couldn't help but wonder just how far Karen would go. What was she capable of if things didn't go her way? He had no idea, but he was about to find out. The weeks that followed Karen's last visit were a blur for Alex. His mind kept returning to the HOA letter that had arrived, the one where Karen had made it clear she expected compliance. Despite her insistence on perfection, Alex had tried to remain calm, telling himself it wasn't worth making a fuss. He had reluctantly removed the gnome as she requested, and hoped that would be the end of the matter. But it wasn't. One evening, as the sky began to darken, Alex found himself finishing dinner in the small, dimly lit kitchen of his house. The house had always been a quiet retreat, a place where he could unwind after a long day of work. But recently, it had become a source of stress. Every time he walked past his front door, he saw the bare spot in his flower bed where the gnome used to stand. He hated that Karen had forced him to remove it, but the worst part was how she had somehow made him feel guilty for something so small. His mind wandered back to the previous week when Karen had come over to inspect his yard. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just a stickler for rules. There was something about her that made him uneasy. She had always been so self-assured, so confident in her role as HOA president. But why had she chosen to focus so much on his small, harmless decoration? There were so many other houses in the neighborhood, yet she had singled him out. It didn't make sense. Alex sighed and cleared the table. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of sirens in the distance. He looked out the window but couldn't see anything at first. His neighborhood was usually quiet, and sirens were a rare occurrence. Then, as the sound grew louder, he saw flashing lights through the trees. His heart raced. Something was wrong. He grabbed his jacket and rushed outside, hoping it wasn't his house. But as he approached the street corner, his stomach dropped when he saw the thick black smoke rising into the air. It was coming from his direction. His mind raced. Was it a fire? Could it be his house? He broke into a run, his feet pounding against the pavement. As he turned the corner, the sight before him made his breath catch in his throat. Flames were leaping from his roof, and the fire trucks were already parked in front of his house. Firefighters were rushing around, trying to control the blaze, but it seemed as though the fire was spreading quickly. "Is anyone inside?" one of the firefighters called out as he hurried past Alex. Alex shook his head, his voice trembling. No, I don't think anyone's in there. I just got home. I don't understand. How did this happen?" The firefighter gave him a brief look of sympathy but quickly moved on to the house. Alex stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching in disbelief as his home, his sanctuary, was consumed by flames. The heat was so intense that even from a distance, it felt as if the fire was burning him alive. He felt helpless. All he could do was watch. The fire department worked tirelessly through the night, but it wasn't until the morning that the fire was finally put out. Alex was left standing outside, his clothes covered in soot, as he surveyed the damage. His house, the place where he had lived for so many years, was now nothing more than a smoldering shell. The authorities arrived shortly after, taking their statements and inspecting the scene. Alex was asked if he had any idea what might have caused the fire, but he was at a loss. There was no obvious reason for it. No electrical issues. No gas leaks. Nothing that would explain how the fire started. The fire marshal confirmed what Alex already suspected: this wasn't an accident. Someone had intentionally set the fire. It wasn't just a random event, it was targeted. His house, his life, had been destroyed on purpose. Alex was in shock. He couldn't bring himself to believe it. Who would do such a thing? He had heard of arson before, but never in his quiet neighborhood. Who could possibly have a reason to destroy his home? His mind quickly jumped to Karen. He remembered her visit, her cold demeanor, the way she had treated him over something so small and insignificant. Could it be her? Could she have taken things this far? But why would she? Alex couldn't answer that. All he knew was that someone had burned his house to the ground, and the only person who seemed to have a reason to hurt him was Karen. For the next few days, Alex was consumed with confusion and anger. His life had been upended in a way he never imagined. He stayed in a temporary rental while the fire investigators tried to piece together what had happened. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. This had to be Karen. She had been harassing him for months, making his life miserable over nothing, and now, this. It was too much of a coincidence. As he walked through the wreckage of his home, his heart ached. His belongings, the memories of a life well lived, were now gone. Everything he had worked for, everything he had cared about, was reduced to ashes. The fire had taken so much from him, and yet, it felt like it was only the beginning of something much worse. But as he stood there, watching the last remnants of the fire smolder, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. He would find out the truth, and he would make her pay for what she had done. This wasn't just about a gnome or a silly lawn decoration anymore. It was about justice. And Alex was ready to fight for it, no matter what it took. The days following the fire felt like a blur to Alex. Everything that had once been familiar and comforting now seemed distant, as if his life had been ripped apart in a matter of hours. His home, the place he had poured his heart and soul into, was gone. The physical damage was obvious, but the emotional toll was even worse. His sense of security, his peace, had been shattered. He stayed in a small, rented apartment while the investigation into the fire continued. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. It didn't feel like home. There was no garden to tend to, no familiar furniture to sink into at the end of a long day. It felt cold and impersonal. Every time he passed the pile of ash where his house used to stand, he felt a pang of loss. It was hard to imagine that he would ever feel at peace again. The investigators continued to poke around the site, searching for clues that might explain how the fire had started. They told him it would take time to confirm anything, but the signs pointed to arson. They didn't have much evidence yet, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he already knew the truth. Every time he thought of Karen, the anger bubbled up inside him again. He couldn't help but wonder if she had done this. She had been the one to drive him to the edge, pushing him with her constant demands and unreasonable rules. She had been the one to make him feel like an outsider in his own neighborhood. Now, she was the one he blamed for everything that had happened. Despite the investigators' reassurances, Alex couldn't stop thinking about Karen. She had always been difficult, but this was something far more sinister. He couldn't just let it go. The fire had destroyed his life, and he wasn't about to let her get away with it. But there was one problem: he didn't have any concrete evidence. There was no way to prove that Karen had set the fire, not yet. Without evidence, it would all just be his word against hers. And in a case like this, who would believe him? Alex knew he had to act fast. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the authorities to solve the case. He needed to find a way to gather evidence, to prove that Karen was behind this. But where would he start? What if he was wrong? What if he was just letting his anger cloud his judgment? It was a question that weighed heavily on him, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't live like this. He couldn't let the fear and uncertainty control his life. He needed answers. And if the authorities weren't going to give them to him, he would find them himself. The first step was to start talking to the neighbors. Many of them had seen Karen around the time of the fire, and Alex knew that the more people he spoke to, the more likely he was to uncover something useful. He reached out to a few of the neighbors who had lived in the area for a long time, people who knew Karen well. He tried to keep his emotions in check, but it wasn't easy. Every time he mentioned the fire, his hands would shake, and the anger would rise in his chest. To his surprise, several neighbors were willing to talk. Some had seen Karen acting strangely in the days leading up to the fire. One neighbor, a woman named Marie, told Alex that she had noticed Karen standing across the street from his house on the night before the fire. Marie didn't think much of it at the time, but now, in hindsight, it seemed suspicious. "She was just standing there, staring at your house," Marie said, shaking her head. "I didn't think anything of it back then. But now that all this has happened, it just feels wrong." Alex listened intently. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He thanked Marie and made a note of the information. As he spoke to more neighbors, he began to piece together a picture of Karen's behavior in the days before the fire. Some said she had been acting strangely, while others had noticed her lurking around the neighborhood late at night. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to make him more certain that Karen was involved. But even with all the suspicions and rumors, Alex still didn't have enough to take action. He needed something concrete, something that would hold up in court. And that's when he realized what he had to do. If he couldn't catch Karen directly, he would have to go after the people who had enabled her. He would have to expose the corruption within the HOA. The more Alex thought about it, the more the idea made sense. The HOA was supposed to be there to protect the interests of the residents, to ensure that everyone was treated fairly. But Karen had turned it into a personal power trip. She had used her position to bully and manipulate people, and now, it seemed, she had crossed the line. Alex knew he couldn't take down the HOA on his own. But if he could gather enough support from the other residents, he might be able to expose the truth. It wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to try. After all, this was his life that had been destroyed. And if he was going to get it back, he would have to fight for it. The next few days were spent talking to more neighbors, gathering evidence, and trying to build a case against Karen. It was slow going, and there were times when Alex felt like giving up. But every time he thought about how his life had been torn apart, he found the strength to keep going. He couldn't let Karen win. He wouldn't. As the days passed, Alex grew more determined. He wasn't just going to rebuild his house, he was going to rebuild his life. And Karen was going to pay for what she had done. The day of the trial arrived sooner than Alex had expected. The courtroom, a stark and impersonal space, buzzed with quiet conversation as the trial preparations began. Alex sat in the back, nervously shifting in his seat, trying to calm his racing heart. He had been through so much already, losing his home, his sense of security, and now he had to face the person he believed responsible for it all. Karen. She sat at the front, confidently surrounded by her lawyer and a few supporters from the HOA. Alex could hardly believe it. Karen, the woman who had tormented him for months, was now sitting in a courtroom, facing serious accusations. The anger he had carried for so long surged within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was his chance to finally get justice, to prove that Karen had gone too far. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. The trial began with the usual formalities. The prosecutor presented their opening statement, outlining the charges against Karen: arson, negligence, and abuse of her position as HOA president. The prosecutor emphasized that the fire had been no accident and that Karen's actions had led directly to the destruction of Alex's home. Alex listened closely, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been prepared for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. His mind kept flashing back to the night of the fire, the heat, the smoke, the helplessness he had felt standing on the sidewalk, watching everything he had worked for burn. Karen's lawyer stood next, ready to defend her. His opening statement was a smooth, calculated attempt to discredit Alex's claims and paint Karen as a well-meaning, hard-working individual who had never intended for things to go this far. He claimed the fire was a tragic accident and that there was no evidence to suggest Karen had been involved. As Karen's lawyer spoke, Alex's stomach twisted with frustration. He knew the truth. He had gathered the evidence, testimonies from neighbors who had seen Karen lurking around his house, the strange behavior she had exhibited in the days leading up to the fire. But would it be enough? Would it be enough to convince the jury? The first witness called to the stand was a neighbor named Marie, the same woman who had told Alex about seeing Karen standing outside his house the night before the fire. Her testimony was straightforward, but it was the kind of detail that could make a difference. Marie confirmed that she had seen Karen staring at Alex's house, looking around as if she was waiting for something. The defense lawyer quickly attempted to discredit Marie's testimony, suggesting that she was simply mistaken or had misinterpreted the situation. But the jury listened closely, and Alex saw some of them nodding, paying attention to the details. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a crack in the defense's argument. Next, the prosecutor called Alex to the stand. His heart skipped a beat as he walked to the witness box, the eyes of the entire room now focused on him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was his moment to speak up, to share his side of the story. He had prepared for this, but nothing could fully prepare him for the weight of the moment. "Mr. Alex," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court what happened the night of the fire?" Alex cleared his throat and began recounting the events of that night. He spoke of how he had arrived home to see the smoke rising from his house, how he had stood helpless as firefighters worked to put out the flames. He described the devastation he felt, the loss of everything he had worked for. "I don't understand," Alex said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't have any enemies. I followed the rules. I did everything I was supposed to do. But Karen was different. She made my life miserable for months. I started to think maybe I was just imagining things, but then, the fire happened. I can't help but believe she was behind it." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his belief. The jury was silent, watching him closely. Alex's heart raced, but he didn't look away. He needed them to understand, to see the truth. He wasn't just fighting for his house, he was fighting for justice. Karen's lawyer immediately stood to cross-examine Alex. He tried to paint him as an angry, vengeful man who was simply looking for someone to blame. He suggested that Alex had a personal vendetta against Karen and was using the fire as an opportunity to take her down. But Alex stayed calm. He knew what the truth was, and he wasn't going to let anyone twist it. "Mr. Alex," the lawyer said with a sly grin, "are you sure you're not just looking for a way to ruin Karen's life because of a few minor disagreements over your property?" Alex didn't flinch. "It's not just about the property. It's about how she treated me, how she treated all of us in this neighborhood. She used her position to control people, to bully them into submission. I didn't deserve that. No one does." The lawyer attempted a few more questions, but Alex stood firm. Karen's lawyer had nothing left to say. The damage had been done. The jury had seen the sincerity in Alex's voice, and they were starting to see the cracks in Karen's defense. As the trial continued, more evidence came to light. The investigators confirmed that the fire had been deliberately set, though they couldn't definitively tie Karen to it just yet. But the circumstantial evidence was mounting, and the pieces were falling into place. The trial wasn't over yet, but Alex could feel the shift. The tide was turning in his favor. The prosecutor's closing arguments would be the next chance to make their case, and Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the first time since the fire. He wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for certain: Karen was going to have a hard time getting out of this one. As the court adjourned for the day, Alex sat quietly in his seat, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. The day after Alex's testimony, the courtroom was filled with a heavy sense of anticipation. The defense team had already presented their case, and now it was the prosecution's turn to make its final push. The tension was palpable as everyone waited for the closing arguments to begin. Alex sat in his seat, his mind racing. He had done everything he could. His testimony had been heartfelt, and the evidence was starting to add up. But despite all the signs pointing to Karen, the case was still far from over. The jury had to decide, and it would be a long road before they reached a verdict. Karen sat in the front row, her expression unchanged. She had been calm throughout the trial, her usual cold demeanor never wavering. She had the look of someone who believed she could still control the situation, no matter how things were going in the courtroom. But Alex could see the subtle cracks in her confidence. She wasn't as certain as she had been at the start. As the prosecutor stood to deliver his closing argument, Alex felt a surge of hope. The lawyer's words were strong and direct, emphasizing the key points of the case: the suspicious circumstances surrounding the fire, Karen's strange behavior in the days leading up to it, and the testimony from the neighbors who had seen her lurking near Alex's house. The prosecutor was painting a picture of a woman who had used her position of power to intimidate and control others, and Alex felt a growing sense that the truth was finally coming to light. The defense lawyer, on the other hand, was more measured in his approach. He focused on discrediting the evidence and attacking Alex's character. He painted him as an angry man who had been looking for a reason to bring down Karen, someone who had overreacted to a few minor disagreements. He also questioned the reliability of the witnesses, trying to cast doubt on their testimony. His goal was clear: to make Alex appear as though he was simply trying to blame Karen for something that had happened by accident. But Alex knew the truth. He knew the fire hadn't been an accident. He knew that Karen had made his life a living nightmare and that it had all led to this moment. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. As the defense finished its closing remarks, the judge called for a recess. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations, but Alex could barely hear anything over the pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The jury would deliberate, and the fate of the case would rest in their hands. Over the next few hours, Alex could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He tried to focus on the arguments, but his mind kept wandering back to the fire. He thought about everything he had lost: his home, his sense of security, his peace. It felt like he had been fighting for so long, and now he was so close to the finish line. The courtroom doors finally opened, and the jury returned. The air grew thick with tension as the judge called everyone to attention. Alex could feel his palms sweat as he gripped the edge of his seat. The moment of truth had arrived. The jury foreman stood and cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Thompson, guilty of arson, negligence, and abuse of her position as HOA president." Alex's heart leapt in his chest. For a moment, he could barely process the words. Karen, the woman who had made his life a living hell, was being held accountable for the destruction she had caused. He had won. The justice he had been fighting for was finally within his reach. The judge looked sternly at Karen, who sat frozen in her seat, her face pale. "Karen Thompson, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for your role in the arson. You will also be required to pay restitution to the victim, Mr. Alex, for the damages to his property and the emotional distress you caused." The courtroom erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs. Alex could hardly believe it. The weight that had been hanging over him for so long seemed to lift in that instant. He had won, and Karen was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Karen, still in shock, stood up slowly. She glanced around the courtroom, her eyes darting from person to person as if looking for someone to help her. But no one moved. The neighbors who had once been afraid of her were now staring at her with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. They had all seen her for what she truly was, and now, they didn't have to live under her thumb anymore. As Karen was led away by the officers, Alex felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't just about winning the case, it was about reclaiming his life. The fire had destroyed so much, but now, he could begin to rebuild. He wasn't going to let the past define him. He had fought for his home, for his peace, and now he could finally move forward. The trial had been a long and difficult journey, but Alex knew that it had changed him. He wasn't the same man who had stood on the sidewalk that night, helpless as his house burned to the ground. He was stronger now, more determined, and more capable of standing up for what was right. The victory wasn't just about Karen's guilt, it was about the power of resilience, the strength to keep fighting even when the odds were stacked against you. And Alex had proven that, no matter what, he would never back down. The day after the trial had concluded, Alex found himself sitting at the kitchen table of his temporary apartment, staring out the window. The sun was setting over the city, casting a warm glow across the streets below. But despite the peaceful view, his mind was still racing. The victory in court felt surreal, almost too good to be true. Karen, the woman who had tormented him for so long, was finally facing consequences for her actions. But as much as he wanted to enjoy this moment, there was still a sense of unease in his chest. The quiet hum of city life outside did little to settle his thoughts. Alex couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Karen try to appeal the decision? Would she try to make his life difficult again, even from prison? He couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't going to go down without a fight. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He stood up, surprised to see a familiar face standing in the hallway. It was Marie, the neighbor who had testified during the trial. She smiled at him, holding a small box in her hands. "I thought I'd drop by and check on you," Marie said softly. "I know everything's been so hectic lately, but I wanted to give you this." Alex raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What's this?" Marie handed him the box. It was small and unassuming, wrapped in plain brown paper with a simple string tied around it. "It's a little something to show my appreciation for everything you've done. You've been through so much, and I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to Karen." Alex smiled, touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Marie said with a laugh. "But after everything that's happened, I think it's the least I could do." He opened the box carefully. Inside, he found a small, hand-carved wooden gnome. It was simple yet beautiful, with intricate details that made it feel personal. Alex couldn't help but laugh softly as he picked it up. It was a gnome, just like the one Karen had made him remove from his yard. The irony wasn't lost on him. "It's perfect," Alex said, looking up at Marie with a grin. "Thank you, really." Marie smiled back. "I figured you could use a little reminder of what really matters, like having people who support you." For the first time in days, Alex felt a sense of warmth fill his chest. The feeling of victory, of finally standing up for himself, was beginning to sink in. It wasn't just about the trial. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about the community, the neighbors who had seen through the chaos and supported him when it mattered most. As the evening went on, Alex and Marie sat down together, sharing stories about the neighborhood and reflecting on everything that had happened. They talked about the trial, about the relief of seeing Karen finally held accountable, but they also spoke about the future. About what life would be like now that Karen was out of the picture. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Alex felt a sense of peace. The next few days passed by in a blur. Alex kept busy, working on plans to rebuild his home, but there was something different about him now. He no longer felt like a victim of circumstance. He had fought for what was right, and he had won. But more than that, he had learned something important along the way. He had learned the value of standing up for himself, of not letting anyone push him around. The neighborhood began to settle back into its usual routine, but Alex could sense a change. Without Karen's presence looming over them, people started to speak out more, to share their thoughts and opinions without fear of reprisal. It was a quiet revolution, one that had taken place without anyone even realizing it. The power of Karen's reign over the neighborhood had been broken, and Alex had played a key role in that change. One afternoon, as Alex was walking through the neighborhood, he ran into one of his other neighbors, a man named Frank, who had always been a bit of a recluse. Frank had never been involved in any HOA disputes, but Alex had noticed him watching the trial from the sidelines. "Hey, Alex," Frank called out, walking up to him. "I just wanted to say, I never thought someone would stand up to Karen like that. You did something no one else could do. You got rid of the problem." Alex smiled, grateful for the compliment. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "I had help. A lot of people helped me." Frank nodded. "Yeah, but you were the one who led the charge. You made sure she couldn't keep doing what she was doing. That takes guts." Alex felt a sense of pride, knowing that he had made a difference. The weight of everything that had happened still lingered, but it wasn't the same weight it had been before. It wasn't the weight of helplessness. It was the weight of responsibility, of knowing that his actions had affected real change. That evening, as Alex sat in his apartment, he glanced down at the wooden gnome that Marie had given him. It sat on the windowsill, a quiet reminder of everything he had overcome. He thought about the people who had supported him, about the neighbors who had come together to fight back against the tyranny of one person's power. Karen was gone now, and her influence was fading. But Alex knew that the real victory wasn't just about removing her from the neighborhood. The real victory was the way the community had rallied together. The way they had realized that their voices mattered, that they didn't have to live in fear of someone who wanted to control them. And as Alex looked out the window, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His fight wasn't over, but he had won the most important battle. The future was his to shape, and he was ready to take it on. The days following Karen's conviction felt like a quiet rebirth for Alex. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and he could breathe again. The fire, the destruction, the uncertainty, it all seemed so distant now. What had once been a nightmare was now a chapter in the past. And although the scars from that time would never truly fade, Alex felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. His life, once full of constant worry and tension, had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The process of rebuilding his home was underway, and though it would take time, Alex found himself excited for the first time in ages. He had a vision for his house, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in his way. The gnome Marie had given him sat proudly on the windowsill, a symbol of everything he had fought for. It was a small, simple gesture, but it meant the world to him. It reminded him that there were people who cared, people who had stood by him through thick and thin. The neighborhood, too, had begun to change. Without Karen's overbearing presence, people felt freer. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now exchanged pleasantries, spoke openly about their concerns, and even came together for the occasional barbecue. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. People were starting to trust one another again, and Alex could see it. He wasn't the only one who had been affected by Karen's reign. Everyone had felt the weight of her control, but now, that weight was gone. One afternoon, as Alex walked down the street, he noticed more people outside, smiling and chatting with each other. There was a sense of community again, something that had been missing for so long. He felt a warmth in his chest as he saw how the neighborhood was healing. It wasn't just about his victory in court. It was about the change that had taken place, the way the neighborhood had come together to reclaim their lives from Karen's oppressive rule. As he walked past a few familiar houses, he was greeted by neighbors who had once kept their distance. People who had avoided him out of fear of Karen's wrath were now offering friendly waves. Some stopped to talk, expressing their gratitude for what he had done. Alex smiled and nodded, knowing that these small moments were the true rewards of his battle. He had done something that went beyond just saving his own home. He had sparked a change, and that was something he would always be proud of. Later that week, Alex received a letter in the mail. It was from the HOA, the very organization Karen had once controlled. At first, Alex felt a sense of apprehension, wondering if they were going to try to take control again. But when he opened the letter, he was surprised to find that it was a letter of apology. The new board members had taken over, and they expressed their regret for the way Karen had run the HOA. They promised to work with the community and ensure that no one would ever face the kind of harassment and intimidation that Alex had endured. Alex sat back, reading the letter over again. He hadn't expected this. In a way, it felt like the final chapter had been written. The community was healing, the HOA was changing, and Karen's hold on the neighborhood was officially broken. The system that had once been used to control people was now working to bring them together. That evening, Alex stood in front of his house, looking at the progress that had been made. The structure was beginning to take shape again. It wasn't the same as before, but it didn't need to be. He didn't need things to return to the way they were, he needed them to be better. And they were. The fire had taken a lot from him, but it had also given him something he hadn't expected: strength. He had stood up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. He had fought for his home, for his dignity, and for his future. And in doing so, he had not only changed his own life but had also helped change the lives of those around him. As Alex watched the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The past was behind him, and the future was filled with possibilities. He wasn't just rebuilding his home, he was rebuilding his life. And he knew that, no matter what challenges came his way, he had the strength to face them. The fire had burned his house down, but it hadn't burned his spirit. It hadn't burned the community that had rallied behind him. It hadn't burned the truth. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Justice had been served, and Alex was finally free. With a final glance at the house, Alex turned and walked down the street, a sense of satisfaction and contentment filling him. He had won. The fight was over, and for the first time in a long time, he could finally move forward. The future was his to shape, and he was ready to take on whatever came next.